So I've got to say, this is one of my favorite parts about any build project, where we make the big decisions about the whole composition and design. What shape should the body be? Something traditional, something more unconventional? What kind of woods do we want to use? What style hardware? How are we going to fit it all together? What's the big picture aesthetic? I printed off the inspiration that we chose. This tele style guitar, on the one hand, is traditional in terms of the shape and the body, yet at the same time, this one has some unique changes. This has a rosewood top. It doesn't have a gloss finish. It has a rear route of the control. There's no pickguard, giving a much more clean and modern aesthetic to it, which I just love. So I'm gonna try to replicate it on this series. The first thing we need to do is choose our wood. Obviously, we're gonna start with rosewood on the top, rosewood on the back. Now, for the body wood in the middle, traditionally, Telecasters have either alder or ash as their body, but I find it's really hard to go wrong with mahogany. Whether you can get your hands on genuine mahogany, or in our case, Kaya, an African species, very similar in look and feel to mahogany. It's just a great building wood. It has a lot of big fat tones to it, and most importantly, it just sounds great. I went down in the wood stacks area and found the perfect African mahogany blank for the center body wood of our guitar build. When you pick your blanks, there's a couple things to look for. The first is the cut of the wood. You hear in guitar making circles about how people want the wood to be quarter sawn. And what that means is, when you look at the grain of the wood, it goes up and down, or as vertical as possible. This is an indication of being quarter sawn and helps the wood be dimensionally stable. Meaning that when humidity changes, the expansion and contraction are proportional in all directions. So it isn't like it expands this way and causes a cup, or this way and causes a warp. It just gives you a little bit of an insurance policy against future problems of the way the wood moves. The second thing I look at, particularly in an electric body blank, what is the weight of it? The weight range of different wood species varies. Mahogany blanks can weigh anywhere from 7 pounds to 12 or 13 pounds, and when choosing a blank, typically the lighter the better. Obviously, it's going to get lighter as we cut some of the material away, but a 9-pound blank is about where I'm trying to look. If it ends up 9.5, that's not the end of the world. It's really hard to find a blank that has absolutely everything we're looking for. This one right here was a pretty good compromise. So if you look at the grain of the wood, it's not completely vertical. This one's about 45 degrees off quarter. But at the same time, it's not completely flat sawn where I think we could have some cupping or twisting problems. And it's nice and light, weighing it at only 8.6 pounds. Next, we're going to look at the rosewood and look what our candidates are there. When it comes to choosing wood for the front and back, you're essentially looking at the aesthetics. So, coming back to our picture, the grain pattern on this is pretty straight. I mean, it's almost like how an acoustic guitar would be. I think that's part of what makes this thing look so clean and so nice. So we've got a couple of candidates here. We have this one. It has really nice straight grain. It's got great colors. It's got some reds in it, browns, a little bit of black. It'll look really great, particularly under finish. And then here's our other candidate. This one's a little darker. It still has very nice straight grain. It's got a little bit of a curve to it. It's got much heavier darks. It's got some more reds. I like this one a little better for the top because we have some nice dark components on the top here. This has darks. Now I realize the grain isn't exactly the same, but I think it'll look nice when we lay this out. Both of these pieces are probably things that would have been on an acoustic guitar, but they weren't because there's some cracks, but they're outside of our pattern. Even if they were up in our pattern, they still would be okay because we could glue them back together and then we're gonna affix them to our substrate. They'd be perfectly fine. I use this kind of wood for this stuff all the time. So I think this one will be our top, this one will be our back, and then it'll all go on top of our mahogany blank. The last thing we need to do before settling on these is to measure the combined thickness of all of them. In this case, we want it to be 1.75 inches, which is traditional for a Telecaster. It's a lot easier to take material off than it is to add material on. So as long as your combined thickness is equal to or greater than 1.75 inches, you're good to go. Our pieces here, when stacked on top of each other, have a combined thickness that's slightly higher than our goal, but that's no problem. We'll run them through the drum sander later and we'll get them exactly where we want. All right, we got our pieces chosen, but before we dive in, another thing that's super important is you want to make sure the woods that you're working with are dry. If you're working with us or another tone wood vendor who's kiln drying the wood, who's seasoned the wood, you're pretty much good to go right out of the chutes. But if you buy wood from a lumber yard, or you salvage it, or you get it on eBay and you don't know, there's really two practical, easy things you can do to ensure the wood you're working with is dry. One would be to just store the wood and not build with it for a while. As a general rule, keep it around 45% relative humidity, 1 inch per year. So if you have an electric body blank, let's say it's a little shy of 2 inches thick, that you'd want to store that for about 2 years before you used it. The other thing you can do is you can use a moisture meter. So a moisture meter is a way to quickly get a number. It doesn't work great with thin pieces of wood like for an acoustic guitar, but fine for an electric body blank. All right, we're ready to start building. The first step is getting these edges ready to glue. Typically this is referred to as jointing an edge. When you join an edge, you need to make these edges dead straight and square, so when we bring the two pieces together, we get what's called a light tight joint, or a seam that's so tight that light won't pass through it. And when we do that, what we're going to end up with is a join that's so perfect you will not even be able to see a line. To do this, we're going to use a machine jointer, and that's a pretty typical way to do a body blank like this. Typically, the first step is to joint the face to be perfectly flat before working on squaring and flattening the edges. You need the face that rides along the fence of the jointer to be dead flat. Now, since the faces of the plates that I have are already dead flat, I don't need to do any more prep on these before I joint the edge. Once you know the faces are flat, then you run the edge through the jointer, ensuring that it's a perfect 90-degree angle. So after a few passes, the board will be both perfectly square and perfectly straight. So what do you do if you don't have a jointer? Here would be my recommendation. Just buy a one-piece body blank. It'll save you a lot of time and effort getting your joints lined up and glued together. For the top and back plates, there are several ways to get a perfectly jointed edge. You could use a hand plane, or you could use a known flat surface like a fingerboard leveler or a table saw with some sandpaper attached, and then very carefully make a few passes with the sides of the plates just to true it up. Before we power up the jointer, one important step to note. I have already gone to the belt sander and knocked the corners off each one of these edges. And I've done it for everything we're going to join. I've done it on the mahogany, and I've done it on both pieces of the rosewood. If you get a tight enough join, it will be next to impossible to find your center line. So by knocking those little corners out right there, it'll be easier for you to come back later and find center. Okay, let's get to it. Now that I've run it through a few times, I'm going to use a square and I'm going to check it in a few places down the body blank. This one isn't exactly where I want it, so I'm going to run it through a few more times. Okay, now it looks square, looks like the edges are dead flat, and we can move on to the rosewood plates. The process is basically the same, but you'll find because they're so thin, getting the edge to be absolutely perfect is a bit of a different animal. So you're going to want to run them both through at the same time. And again, you want to be able to hold these up to the light and not be able to see any light coming through that seam. If you're struggling to get your joint light tight, once again, take something that's a known flat surface. A table saw works extremely well, and put a piece of sandpaper on it and run your edges along the fence. I'm using 220 grit here. And have a nice straight square fence, and then just very gently sand that edge, push in one direction. Don't let the end come off and hang over, because then you'll be sanding on one side more than the other. And typically within 25, 50 strokes of the sandpaper, you can take a joint that's pretty close and bring it all the way in so it'll be completely light tight. Okay, we're ready to glue. I'm just going to use Titebond Original. I think it's one of the best glues. It's super easy to work with. You have plenty of open time. We don't want to go crazy with the glue, but we want to make sure that there's plenty of glue on the joint. Some will squeeze out, which is fine. Then I'll carefully align these on 4 bar clamps using the triangles on the top and bottom as guides to help keep me aligned. It's not super critical in this case because I'm going to be covering both the top and the back with rosewood, but it's just good to do it right. We're going to start by snugging up the top 2 clamps, the top one and the back one. Try to get them right at the edge. I want to make sure that they're aligning so one isn't very high against the other. It's not going to be a big problem if it is, because we've got some thickness we're going to ultimately have to sand out of this blank. The clamps need to be tight, but we don't have to put like the grip of death on these things. I mean, usually if you've got a good joint, you don't need to have 10 tons of clamping pressure. What you can't do is try to make up any imperfections in your joint by just super squeezing your joint together. You really risk it failing at some point down the road and coming apart, which you don't want. I like to use a cloth instead of a paper towel to wipe my center seam down, get the glue off of it, because the paper towels leave little pieces. And obviously there's gonna be squeeze out underneath. Not super worried about that. We'll take care of that once it cures. Okay, this looks good. Now we're gonna glue up the rosewood plates. So I'm just gonna put a couple of reference lines here just to sort of help me stay on my mark where I want to align my plates. When I hold the glue bottle, I like to just put my little finger right there and just use my finger kind of as almost like a little fence. Just kind of run it right down the edge. Just a little, you don't need a ton. This is probably more than I need, but the only thing extra is gonna hurt you is it's gonna get a little slipping around when you clamp. On these thin plates, I like to just hold the edges flat, so I'll just take a piece of wax paper, put them over the edge, and use a spring clamp. You need to kind of try to keep the plates as aligned as you clamp as possible. If one heaves up too much, then you have a lot of sanding to do. I'm just cleaning the glue off so I can see what I'm working with here. So before we snug up the clamps on these plates, because if you snug them up too much, what'll happen is the plate will and it'll sweep up and then they'll come apart. So we're gonna put a weight in the middle. You can use absolutely anything. In our case, we're gonna use some books, big pile of Dan's books and some other stuff there. See, guitar books are used for all kinds of things. And again, we don't need to put the grip of death on these clamps. Snug is plenty tight enough. This one's ready to go. Off camera, I'll go ahead and repeat this process for the back rosewood, then let all 3 pieces cure overnight. Good morning. We've had a few hours to let this dry, and in just a moment, when I loosen these clamps, we should find all of our pieces are joined perfectly. If you remember, when I measured yesterday, the combined thickness of all of our woods was a little bit higher than I'd like. So today, we're gonna sand them down to size. So let's get these unclamped and prepped to sand. The reason you want to take the pressure off the clamps first is because if you take the books off first and there's a lot of clamping pressure, it can shove the plate up. So just back the pressure off. And let's remove our weights from the center. Don't tell Dan what I did with his books. But this all looks good. So, and we got a nice tone. We got a little glue here as expected. Let's just scrape that off. So I'm gonna start by clamping it down to the workstation. Then with my Stewmac Ultimate Scraper, I use pretty firm pressure and I'll just slowly start scraping away the glue. The reason I want to scrape the glue off before I start to thin the plate down is because that glue will gum up the sandpaper pretty quickly. Okay. Now we'll do the same thing to the body wood in the back plate. We want to make sure all the stickers are off these pieces, and then we'll go to the sander. Okay, so the sanding's all done, and I'm super pleased with how everything turned out. The body blank really turned out great. It's just perfect. I mean, it's pretty much dimensionally right on the money of where we need it to be. Looks great, feels great. The top and back turned out wonderful. The colors really jumped out off the rosewood. The grain looks amazing. This one's gonna be on our top, and this is gonna be our show side. I marked the show side with tape. And then the back, it looks really great too. This is a beautiful piece of rosewood. A lot of purples in here, a lot of dark browns. There's some black in here. And we have a couple cracks that we're gonna have to remember to work around when we glue the panel up and basically lay out our body, but this is gonna be fantastic. The only other thing that we have to do is we have to make sure that the final dimension is pretty close to where we wanna be because we can't really sand on this much later. We're gonna go ahead and measure this just to double check, but we should be right on the money. We are 1.754, so we are just a tiny bit proud of 1.75, and that's exactly where we want to be, because with a little bit of sanding, a little bit of scraping at the end, this thing should come in right about 1.75 inches, which is just perfect. So, in the next episode, we're going to glue up the entire blank, the rosewood top the mahogany body, and the rosewood back. We're gonna glue all that up and get it ready to shape. With that, we'll talk to you on the next video.